Welcome to tonight's class. Tonight we'll be learning about the Omer transformation. So this month, the month of Iyar, today is Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and tonight is the first day of the month of Iyar. Iyar is the one month of the year which has a unique mitzvah associated with every single day of the month. That is, of course, counting the Omer. We start counting the Omer on the second day of Pesach. So part of the second half of Nisan, second half of the month where Pesach falls, we have the mitzvah of counting the Omer. The first few days up until Shavuot in the month of Sivan, we are counting the Omer. But Iyar is the only month which every single day is associated with counting the Omer, and it's a mitzvah that we can say with a bracha, with a blessing every single day, connected to that day, the day of the month, each day of the month of Iyar. So besides for focusing on the counting of the Omer, which we are in middle of now, we'll look at the transformation that happens from the time period of Pesach, from the time of bringing the Omer offering, or prior to that, the night of the Seder, beginning with Pesach, then the counting of the Omer, following up to Shavuot. So the Omer, which is a chametz transformation. Before Passover, we scrub our houses clean of all leavened bread, yet just a few weeks later, chametz becomes a most important element of the Holy Temple service. The question is, why the transformation, and what does it represent in the journey of our soul? So we'll jump into this and look at what the verses tell us we should be doing on Pesach, the counting the Omer, through to Shavuot. So let's jump right into it here. Here we have the verses talking about eating matzah, the prohibition of chametz. So for 7 days you must eat matzos, and the seventh day shall be a festival to Hashem. So the first of the 7 days and the last of the 7 days should be a festival, and then you have the intermediate days of Chol HaMoed. Of course, outside of Israel, in the diaspora, we keep 2 days of Pesach at the beginning, 2 at the end, and then we have 4 days of Chol HaMoed in the middle. Matzos must be eaten these 7 days. No chametz may be seen in your possession, and no leaven may be seen in all of your boundaries. So not only are we not allowed to eat chametz, to eat leaven, things that had risen throughout Pesach, but we also cannot have them in our possession either, which is why we clean our houses, we get rid of the chametz, we sell any chametz which we're keeping in our houses, or we put it aside, we lock it up in a closet, or close it off, and we can sell that to someone that's not Jewish to own over Pesach, and then we can buy it back afterwards. That way we're not owning any chametz on Pesach. And the next verses which we'll read talk about what we should be doing with bringing the Omer offering. So you should count from the day following the Passover holiday, which means the second day of Pesach, when you brought the Omer offering, 7 complete weeks. Until the day after the 7th week, you shall count 50 days, and then you shall present a new meal offering to Hashem, to God. From your settlements bring 2 loaves of bread as a wave offering. They shall be made of 2/10 of an ephah measurement of wheat meal, and shall be baked as leavened bread. They are the first harvest to Hashem, first harvest to God. So here we have, as an introduction to this, to understanding this, we have to recognize that in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, was a chametz-free zone. It was a place that was only Passover items that were allowed to be eaten on Passover were allowed into the temple, into the Beit HaMikdash throughout the entire year. Even the showbread, even the lechem hapanim, the 12 loaves of bread that were put on the table, the two sections of the table, 2 rows, that were baked from week to week. It would sit there for a week, and then they would eat it the following week and replace it. Those loaves of bread were not actually chametz. They were not leavened. They had not risen. It was a very thick dough. Once the water mixes with flour, you have about 18 minutes for it to completely bake in order to prevent it from the leavening process, the rising process, to begin. So the way it was done in the Beis Hamikdash in the temple was in such a method that it was completely baked within the allotted time frame, and it did not become chametz. So any type throughout the entire year, there was no communal offering and no private offering that was brought that had within it chametz. You couldn't bring any other items into the temple. If someone's coming to visit, they didn't bring any, couldn't bring any bread or danishes or pretzels or any other type of things with them into the temple. You have to leave your chametz snacks outside. But the only two exceptions that there were for bringing offerings that were actually risen, that became chametz, there was one communal offering, and that is the one that we're speaking about here, the 2 loaves of bread that were brought on Shavuos. And the second one is a private offering, a thanksgiving offering. If a person wanted to thank Hashem, to thank God for specific miracles that had happened to him, for specific blessings that they had received, if a person wanted to offer thanks, they would bring a karban toda, an offering of bringing thanks to Hashem, and part of that offering, there were a number of loaves, 40 rolls of bread, and which 10 of them specifically need to be have risen and become chametz. So those were the only 2 exceptions when chametz offerings were brought. And as a community, as a communal offering, the only one was on the second day, was on Shavuot. These 2 loaves of bread. What was the Omer offering that was brought? The Omer offering was an offering that was brought out of the very first harvest of barley. The first harvest of barley, the Hebrew word Omer is actually a measurement, which was a tenth of an ephah. I guess about 10 cups of flour or so that were brought during for that offering. Up until that harvest, up until that offering was brought on the second day of Pesach, any new crop, any new grain that was harvested was not allowed to be eaten yet, because the first of the harvest needs to be brought as an offering to Hashem, to say thank you to Hashem for the new crop, and therefore it wasn't permitted to eat or use any of the new crop until the Omer offering was brought on the second day of Pesach. After that, we would begin counting the count of the Omer, the 49 days, 7 complete weeks, up until leading up to Shavuos. And on Shavuot, which in Hebrew, Shavuot means weeks, because we're counting 7 complete weeks, we come to the holiday Shavuot, and then they would bring an offering, this time out of wheat. Wheat takes a little bit longer to be ready to harvest than oats. Oats mature more quickly, ripen more quickly, and therefore the first offering of the Omer is oats, and later on the first offering of wheat was brought on Shavuot. But specifically, that offering brought out of wheat wasn't just like the previous offering, but that one was actually baked into bread, and as we'll see, they were pretty large size loaves of bread. So the Sefer HaChinuch gives more of a description of these 2 loaves of bread. They would do as follows. They would bring 3 sa'ah of new wheat and rub them and pound them just like all meal offerings and grind them. That's a pretty large quantity of wheat. That's about, depending on the opinions, anywhere between 25 and 45 liters. And they would grind them, and from that they would make 2 loaves from them. What was the size of each loaf? So each loaf was 7 handbreadths long, 4 handbreadths wide, and 4 fingers tall. A handbreadth is approximately 8 centimeters. So length, 8 times 7 handbreadths is about 56 centimeters, or 2 feet long. It was 4 handbreadths wide, so I guess a little more than a foot wide, and 4 fingers tall. So a few inches tall. It's quite large loaves of bread. They were square or rectangle in shape. They were baked on the day before the holiday, and on the morrow after their waving, they were eaten by the priests on that day and half the night. So they were baked on they were baked on Erev Shavuot, on the last day of the count of the Omer, and the following day on Shavuot itself, they were then waved in waving motions to all the 6 directions, just like we do with a lulav. which we should wave it in the 6 directions, and then they were eaten by the Kohanim. That was the process of what would happen with those loaves of bread. The Talmud Bavli in Tractate Menachot says that with the two loaves offering, what did the Kohen do? So he says he would extend it toward each of the 4 directions of the skies, and then bring it back. Then he would raise it upward and lower it downward. So we mentioned all the 6 directions: east, west, north, and south, and then up and down. Said Rabbi Chama bar Ukva, sage of the Talmud, explained what was the purpose of the waving. He waved it back and forth in all 4 directions to hold back harmful winds, and he would raise and lower it to hold back the harmful dews. So the purpose of waving in the 4 directions was to bring blessing into the weather patterns, to hold back negative weather patterns that would negatively impact the people and their growing and their harvest and everything else that we needed to do. And the raising up and down was to hold back harmful dews that were not helpful for what we needed, for the moisture necessary for things to grow. So that was how they worked on their climate control back then, was by waving loaves of bread. So this is in short the process, the practical process of what was actually done. The question becomes, how does chametz become a mitzvah? Between Passover and Shavuot, we count the Omer, which means that there are 3 time periods. You have Passover, you have the Omer period, and then you have, after the Omer concludes, you have the holiday of Shavuot. The distinctions between them is that on Pesach, on Passover, chametz is forbidden. For the whole duration of Pesach, we can't have chametz at all. During the Omer period, of course, we're referring to the Omer period after Pesach, it is permitted. Then we are allowed to have chametz, but it's not an obligation. It's not a mitzvah per se. On Shavuot, its consumption is a commandment. The 2 loaves were specifically made of chametz. Then we come to Shavuot, and the 2 loaves, even though it was eaten by the Kohanim, but this was a mitzvah done on behalf of the entire community. It was a communal offering brought on behalf of the entire community. And then the Kohanim were obligated to eat from it. So we need to understand, take a look at, what does chametz mean, what does matzah mean, what is the difference between them, and why is it that if matzah is good for a week and we can't have any chametz, why is it that we're allowed to have it the rest of the year? Why is it that for a certain period of time in between you could have it, but it's not a mitzvah, and then it comes Shavuot, all of a sudden it becomes a unique mitzvah specifically on this holiday of Shavuot to bring these loaves of bread. Specifically, the Torah tells us that it should be leavened, it should become chametz, and afterwards we're back to it being permissible to have it. You could not. What's going on here? What is the deeper meaning and understanding behind matzah and chametz? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How does this all fall into place? This raises the question of chametz is forbidden on Passover. How does it suddenly become an article of a mitzvah with 2 loaves specifically of chametz? Why is it? What's going on? So let's look, in order to have an appreciation and understanding of why this transformation takes place and how it happens, we need to take a look back at what does chametz represent, what does matzah represent, and then we'll be able to understand how this transformation takes place and why it is a mitzvah specifically on Shavuot. So the explanation is that chametz represents ego and haughtiness and logic, while matzah represents the opposite. It is called poor man's bread, as it has no self-importance and no taste. Welcome, Fega. So we discussing here the why it is that on Pesach, on Passover, we're not allowed to have any chametz, just matzah. Then we have Sefirat to Omer, where it's permissible, and then leading up to Shavuot, we mentioned that it is the only communal offering that was brought in temple times in the Beit HaMikdash that was actually out of bread, wheat bread that was specifically chametz. So now we're looking at discussing what does chametz represent and what does matzah represent and what does it mean to us. So the idea of chametz is something that the rising process has begun. It started to rise, which in a spiritual sense that represents the idea of ego and haughtiness, someone being full of themselves, as in something that's full of air, someone that is full of hot air or air of any sort. They're all puffed up. You just like a balloon, you put a needle in and it pops. Ego and haughtiness being someone that's bragging about something that they may or may not have, just trying to build themselves up, make themselves look more special than other people. That's one idea that chametz represents. Another element that chametz represents is logic. And the reason for that is because chametz is something, or bread, is something that's tasty. You have all different types of ingredients in it. You can appreciate it. You can enjoy it. And this represents the idea of something which is logical, something we can understand. We can dissect it and understand it with our intellect, with our emotions. We can, it makes sense to us. Matzah, on the other hand, it represents the opposite. So it's something which is very humble, does not feel his own self-importance. And as well, matzah is something that does not have any taste. It's just flour and water. As a matter of fact, the Pesach Seder, on the night of Pesach, is the only time when we're making a bracha, making the blessing of hamotzi, that we don't dip the matzah or the bread in salt. It's custom to always eat when we break bread, we make the blessing of hamotzi that we dip it in salt. But on Pesach, when we do the Seder, we do not dip the matzah in salt. It cannot have any other flavorings with it. Just in order to fulfill the obligation of eating matzah on the Seder night, it has to be simple matzah without any other added ingredients into the dough, without any added ingredients that we're eating it with. We just eat the matzah plain on its own first. Then afterwards we have the korech sandwich, and you can later on, after that, eat matzah with whatever you want. That's fine as well. But in order to fulfill the obligation of eating matzah, we need to eat it just plain with nothing else, no taste involved, just flour and water, basic. And the idea behind that is serving Hashem, as we'll soon learn, not from a place of logic and understanding, but from a place of belief, trust in Hashem, recognizing that we're willing and ready to do what's asked of us. Not because it makes sense, but because we want to connect to Hashem, just because He told us that we should do it. So let's take a look a little more at the difference between these two methods of serving Hashem. The difference between chametz and matzah: chametz represents ego, as is expressed in the fact that it rises. Matzah represents humility, in that it does not rise. This is the main difference between chametz and matzah. The bread of chametz, which has flavor, symbolizes a person's intellect, which likewise has a flavor. The bread of matzah, on the other hand, is called bread of the pauper, lacking any flavor at all. It represents humility and nullification. That is why matzah is called the bread of faith, because faith transcends reason. So let's discuss this a little bit more for a moment. The difference between serving Hashem out of faith, trust, not because of any reason. The goal is that we want to fulfill whatever is commanded of us, whatever is asked of us. And that's really the beginning to approaching our connection to Hashem. Telling Hashem, whatever you'd like me to do, you created me, you put me here in this world, what would you like me to do? What am I required to do? And try and fulfill it to the best of our ability. In serving Hashem in that manner, even though we may not understand it, but in there it's recognized very strongly our recognition of Hashem and our humility and ability to give up of what we want and doing things just completely because of what Hashem wants. So in this method of serving Hashem, it's complete faith, trust in Hashem that this is what He wants us to do, believing that this is what Hashem wants us to do, and that the only thing that makes a difference to us is practically, what should I be doing? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? And whatever I understand is what Hashem wants from me at that time, that's what I'm willing and ready to do. As the Talmud gives an example, if Hashem would have commanded us that it was a mitzvah to chop down a tree at a specific time, then we would gladly and willingly go and chop down a tree, we would probably also have all kinds of qualifications of what kind of tree and what kind of axe and how much time it should take and all the nuances that come with each of the other mitzvahs. But the point being that whenever we have a mitzvah that we're fulfilling, we're doing it purely because Hashem asks us to do it. That's one method of serving Hashem. Of course, if we're serving Hashem in that method, the downside of that is that it's not really us. We're doing it just with our actions, but we may understand something else. We may want something else, and we're doing it just because that's what Hashem wants. Like people that are serving Hashem or keeping the Torah and mitzvahs just because that's what their parents did, that's what their grandparents did. Eventually, once at a certain point, it doesn't remain. It doesn't last because that's not who we're feeling. That's not what we're understanding, and therefore it's difficult for that to continue. When we serve Hashem with our intellect and our emotions, when we start understanding what we're doing, when we start appreciating with our minds why we're doing a specific mitzvah, we start feeling excited about it. So if we understand why we're lighting Shabbat candles, or why we're putting on tefillin, why we're putting up a mezuzah, and we appreciate the meaning behind it, connecting to Hashem through doing so, and we understand, the more that we understand it, the more that we feel excited about it, and the more that we want to do it. And that way we're not just serving Hashem with our hands, or our feet, or our other physical dimensions. We're also elevating ourselves, as the verse tells us, and we say in our Shabbos davening, Kol atzmotai tomarna, my entire being serves Hashem with our minds and our hearts. That's the ultimate level of serving Hashem. It's not just out of faith, just because out of trust, the belief that this is what Hashem wants me to do, but also serving Hashem with my mind, with our understanding, and with our emotions. When we're able to bring that into the picture, then we're able to constitute real change within ourselves and serve Hashem in a much, much deeper level, not just on an external method of serving Hashem. So having this perspective, now let's take a look at where the Jewish people were holding during their travels and journey from the time of leaving Egypt up until the giving of the Torah, which happened on 50 days later, approximately on Shavuos. Before the exodus from Egypt, the people of Israel were sunken in the 49 gates of impurity. They were not receptacles for godliness. As the verse says, you were naked and bare. God himself, the King of Kings, personally revealed himself and rescued them from Egypt. So what was happening during the time the Jewish people were in Egypt, although they didn't change, their names and their clothing and their language remained the same, but for the most part, in all other aspects of life, although they trusted and believed in Hashem, they also, many of them were worshiping idols, like the Egyptians around them. Many of them were not feeling that strong connection to godliness, to Hashem, so much so that Hashem says, At Erum ve'eri, you were naked and bare. What does it mean that you were naked and bare? You were naked and bare of mitzvot. You didn't have that strong connection to Hashem that we have through Hashem asking us to do something and then fulfilling it, like a simple janitor, someone that's cleaning up a very important building or a palace, or the White House, or prime ministerial offices and building, and that person doesn't really have any connection to the royalty or the high positions of the office that they are cleaning. However, if someone is cleaning a royal palace, and the queen or the king asks them for a specific favor, to get them a cup of water, open a window, do something a little bit differently, by the king or queen or royalty asking the simple person to do for them a favor, suddenly a connection, a bond starts being built between those two individuals. Similarly, between us and Hashem, between us and God, the Hebrew word for mitzvah is also reflected in the Aramaic word tzavta, which means connection. when Hashem gives us commandments, gives us mitzvot, they're not just commandments that Hashem is giving us instructions on what we should do, but those are instructions by which, when we fulfill those instructions, we're connecting ourselves to Hashem at a much stronger and deeper level. So when they were ready, when Hashem was ready to extract the Jewish people and free them from Egypt, at that point, he says they were naked and bare. They didn't have that connection to Hashem. They didn't have any mitzvahs in order to connect them stronger, to make them able to leave Egypt. And not only that, they were holding at a depth of 49 gates. It says there's 49 gates. The Zohar teaches that there's 49 gates of impurity, and the 50th gate of impurity, at that point it would be completely lost. If they would have stayed in Egypt for even a moment longer, it would have been too late to take them out. Similar to when someone may be very ill, and a doctor may say, we have to do something immediately. If you don't do it now, it's too late. We're not going to be able to heal them. There's nothing more we can do for them. If Hashem would have left us in Egypt even a moment longer, it would have been too late to take us out of there. And that was part of the reason why at that moment it had to happen super quickly. It happened quickly at midnight at the time before the redemption came, when he told them it was time to leave. They had to rush out, didn't even allow them time to bake proper food to take with them, just the matzah dough that they made and took with them out of Egypt, out of Mitzrayim, because at that point it was necessary for Hashem himself, not through any messengers, not through any angels or other messengers, but Hashem himself, because it was so imperative that they leave immediately. Hashem himself came and pulled us out of Egypt to make sure that we would not get sunken into the 50th level of impurity. Then we have, to counter that, we then have 49 days of counting of the Omer, 49 days, which parallels the days of after they left Egypt up until the receiving of the Torah. And then on the 50th day, each of those 49 days from counting the Omer, they're not just days, but they're also reflective of character traits that we try our best when we count the Omer, which each day of the counting of the Omer, there's also a character trait that's associated with it. So there's 7 specific character traits, and each one, the way that it's inclusive of all the other 7. So you have 7 times 7 is 49. And then on the 50th, you reach the highest level, the Shar Hanun, the 50th gate of understanding, of godliness, and that's the ultimate on, which we reach on Shavuot. As the Rebbe continues here teaching us this, since this was not a result of their own efforts, but merely a revelation from above, the experience did not change them internally, because they did not have the necessary capabilities. And it was only the revelation that drew them to Hashem, that drew them to God. When they left Egypt, they were not yet free of the evil inside of them, as their animalistic soul was still at full strength. What happened when they left Egypt was they had this tremendous revelation of godliness. It was so exciting that they automatically pulled them out. But such a transformation that took place, it's as if somebody sees in front of them a tremendous miracle happening to them. They see something incredible that happens, and they get all inspired and excited. Okay, I want to become a better person. I want to connect more to Hashem. This is incredible. But if the reason for that change happens just because of something that took place at one moment, it happened one moment, the next moment, it's gone. It doesn't remain. It's not retained. Similarly to what happened to the Jewish people themselves when we left Egypt. A short while later, after leaving Egypt and receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai itself, what happened later on, they started making, when Moshe went up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights and didn't come back, they were busy dancing around the golden calf. They're busy back to worshiping idols again. How's that even possible? So the change that took place at the giving of the Torah, although it was an incredible experience, but that was a change that took place from above. It was an external change and not something that changed within inside of themselves. So throughout this period of leaving Egypt, at that moment when they were extracted, pulled out of Egypt, they had an external change to them. And then they still within them, side of themselves, although they left Egypt, Egypt was not taken out of them yet. It was still left inside of them. And what did they need to do? Throughout the next 49 days was time to experience that complete change. When we believe and trust in Hashem and do things just out of pure faith in Hashem, pure trust in Hashem, doing, what do I need to do and I will do it, that's an external aspect that is affecting the way that we behave. But it's not something that I understand, not something that I feel connected to. It's not something that will remain and I'll retain for a long period of time. It's like a person that decides one day, makes the New Year's resolution, I'm going to start losing weight, I'm going to go to the gym every day, I'm going to do this endeavor, that endeavor, lasts for a couple of weeks, enough to buy the gym membership, and then he doesn't show up. If the resolution is made just because of something external, we got all excited for a few minutes, or a little bit longer, when you're in front of royalty, in front of something extreme revelations, then it gets very exciting. You want to jump into godliness, you want to jump to Hashem and get close. What happens a little while later, once everything kind of calms down, we're back to the norm. We didn't change much. Different times in a person's life that they decide that perhaps now everything's going to be different. A person becomes bar bat mitzvah. The next stage, we get married, have children. All of a sudden we think maybe perhaps we'll become completely different people, be a much better role model, and somehow the next morning we wake up and we're kind of the same people, unless we put in the effort to actually make those changes. So the time of the exodus of Egypt was a time that Hashem inspired them from above with a tremendous experience that pulled them out. They jumped right out and wanted to get close to Hashem, but it was something that was external. In order for them to make an internal change, that required the work throughout those 49 days leading up to the giving of the Torah. And those moments, this is how it reflects on the idea of matzah. The idea of matzah, which we said is just a faith in Hashem, without reason, without understanding, just because Hashem tells us to. That's represented in the experience of leaving Egypt. Then we go on to the next part of counting the Omer, leading up to Shavuot. However, Shavuot comes after the process of the counting of the Omer, during which we refine the 7 traits of the animal soul. At that point, chametz is no longer a contradiction to serving God. To the contrary, we then reach a state where the chametz can be and therefore must be utilized in our performance of Torah mitzvot. Therefore, on Shavuot, we are specifically commanded to bake chametz. If at the time of leaving Egypt we would start thinking, should I leave, should I not leave? Is this something that I want to do? Do I want to go out into the desert, not sure where I'm going? Is this all making sense to me? At the first beginning, when we start approaching our relationship with Hashem, we start questioning every step of the way and saying, I'm only going to do what makes sense to me, then we're not starting out on a very good grounded position. Our first position is we have to accept because this is what Hashem tells us to do. Like when we educate children, we set rules, we put rules in place. There's times that they should understand why these rules are put in place, but as children are growing older, and especially in the younger years, when you set a rule, the rule is just because that's the way it is. With time, you understand and explain as much as we can. So when we begin, the beginning is matzah, the beginning is simple, faith, trust in Hashem. That's the starting point. And then we can start utilizing our ability to understand. Once our perspective is a little bit different, we can start understanding better and feeling our connection to Hashem in a stronger way. And therefore, when it comes to on Passover, when the people of Israel left Egypt, chametz was prohibited. The reason chametz was prohibited was because it was required that they should have a simplistic faith. They were humble and faithful, but they were internally empty. And therefore their intellect, which quote-unquote their chametz within them, was not yet in a desirable state. Their intellect wasn't in a capacity that they were able to utilize it for holiness and godliness because it was so full of the shmutz, so full of the negative, evil things that were opposite of holiness that they experienced throughout their time in Egypt, that it was impossible for them to use that intellect to connect to Hashem. They first start by using their faith in Hashem, being humble and faithful to what Hashem wants, and then later on they were able to transform their intellect and emotions and utilize them for godliness. Only on Shavuot, after the proper completion of the counting of the Omer and refinement of the inner character traits, is the intellect made holy, and then chametz can be made into a mitzvah. So when can chametz be made into a mitzvah? The chametz is representing our intellect, our emotions, the deeper character traits within ourselves, and our perspective, our understanding. When can that be transformed into holiness? After we have this period of Sefirat Omer. During the counting the Omer, which each day represents, as we mentioned, another level within ourselves, another character trait. Once we go through this period and refine ourselves, then we come to Shavuot, and then it becomes, not only is it permissible to have chametz, but it becomes a mitzvah, because then we're able to utilize our understanding and emotions to connect to Hashem on the highest levels, and therefore it becomes a mitzvah. Any comments or questions before we continue? Okay, so bring this back full circle to us in our day-to-day lives a little bit more profoundly. In our day, we do not physically offer the sacrifice of the 2 loaves. That's only done in temple times, but it is still relevant to our soul's spiritual journey during these 3 periods. As our sages said, in every generation, a person must view himself as if he left Egypt. We must always strive to escape the constraints of our body and animal soul, leaving Egypt in a spiritual sense. So the Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, Mem Tzadek Resh Yud Mem, which it also relates to the Hebrew word for Meitzar. Meitzar means confined, limited. The idea, the concept of Yitziat Mitzrayim, of leaving Egypt in our own life, is leaving our own constraints and the things that limit us from growing in our connection to Hashem and allowing ourselves to grow beyond the box that we perhaps placed ourselves in. We all have routines, which of course routines are good and important to have. We all have how we perceive ourselves currently, and perhaps, how many times have I had a discussion with someone about adding in a little bit more, and people say, I'm okay, I'm good where I am. Many of us are comfortable right where we are, and we're not necessarily looking to grow in our observance, and grow in our study, growing in our connection to Hashem. It's important for us to recognize that that's exactly what Mitzrayim is. That's what Egypt is in a spiritual sense, is exactly where I am today, being comfortable where I am. Anytime that we feel comfortable where we are, our job is to try our best to leave that comfort zone and grow a little bit greater, a little bit stronger in our connection to Hashem. It's kind of like coming into this world. When our souls come into this world, into our bodies, and are given our mission here on earth, it's almost like we're put on in the middle of a mountain that we're required to climb. It's either continue working our way up, or slowly, we start going a little bit lower, falling down a little bit backwards. So our job is to constantly keep our eyes at the goal, to try and continue to grow, continue to gain stronger, deeper connections to Hashem, try to leave our own limitations and grow a little bit larger in our connection to Hashem. We do so in the following order. How do we leave our own Egypt, our own limitations, and grow a little bit greater in our connection to Hashem? At the outset, corresponding to the actual exodus from Egypt on Passover, chametz should not be consumed, meaning we should not scrutinize everything from an intellectual viewpoint. Whenever we want to connect to Hashem stronger, our first thing is, what's required of me? What should I do? What is the task at hand that I should do? Once we look at it from that point, we should then, at that point, if we start analyzing everything from an intellectual perspective, our personal perspective might be skewed. We might not be able to understand it properly because we're looking at it from a very different perspective. Instead, we should focus on humility and accepting the yoke of Hashem. That is something that transcends intellect. It's something that's greater than understanding. It's much more profound than what we can understand. When we recognize that, then we could go to the next step of trying our best to understand, trying our best to translate that into feelings, and be able to serve Hashem with joy and with excitement, because we're so excited about what we're doing. This idea is applicable not only at the outset of our general journey to Judaism, but in every situation that can be considered a beginning. For our sages said that in every generation, which means in every situation, a person must view himself as if he left Egypt today. Therefore, this approach applies to every situation. Focus less on your own perspective. As we said earlier, even righteous people need to strive to escape their limitations. So any time that we have a beginning, even every single day, what is the beginning of our day? First thing in the morning, what are we required to do the first thing in the morning when we wake up? The very first words that should come out of our mouths when we wake up is Modani, acknowledging Hashem, thanking Hashem for giving us another chance to live in this world, giving our souls back to us again, recognizing that Hashem is giving us the privilege of having our souls back in us again, acknowledging that, and then we can go on with our day, move on to the next step of waking up and getting dressed and starting to serve Hashem throughout the rest of the day. But the very first step is that acknowledgement, trusting in Hashem, thanking Hashem for what we have, acknowledging that we're ready servants of God to do what Hashem wants, and then we can go on to the next step, trying to internalize it, understand it, and feel it a little bit better. The same thing with the way that we, as we mentioned earlier, with education. We educate children, first set out rules, and then you explain them afterwards. We first need to make sure that children have a strong education of trust, belief in Hashem, and belief in the mitzvahs that we're doing, the Torah that was given, that's the same one that was given a few thousand years ago, that we're continuing on that chain link to this very day. And each and every child, each and every one of us continue in that respect, recognizing that that's the foundation, that's the basis, and from that we then go on to trying to understand and feel it the more that we can, till we come to the level of Shavuot, which will then be the highest level of transforming our intellect into be connected to Hashem. However, once you leave your Egypt, that's the foundation. The beginning is faith, trust in Hashem, and doing it because Hashem tells us. However, once you leave your Egypt, your constraints and limitations, the chametz is no longer prohibited. Even if you cannot fully transform it to holiness, at that point, it is time to focus on your internal character and intellect, your personal chametz, and align it with your spiritual journey. Once we have step number one, our faith, our trust in Hashem, we're ready to do what Hashem wants each and every day in general, and wherever we're starting, that's the starting point. Once we've broken free from that, our next step is to work on our characters, on our understanding, which in this sense, we're calling the chametz within ourselves, the intellect, the feelings, emotions, and understanding, and then we're able to transform our feelings and understanding and utilizing that for spiritual purposes. Of course, the final goal is when we reach a state in which you could, and therefore must, bring your chametz, your intellect, to become a part of your spiritual journey and a vessel for godliness, transforming it entirely. So the ultimate goal is to reach that point that our perspective and our understanding is completely connected to Hashem, completely utilized only for godly purposes, and focusing on what Hashem wants from us, feeling it to the best of our ability, and when our hearts and minds are completely transformed into godliness, which will be representative of Mashiach coming, which is what we celebrate on Shavuos, and therefore we're able to bring loaves of bread that are actually chametz. This is the advantage of Chabad Hasidic philosophy, statement of an adage in Chabad Hasidic thought. Instead of focusing on external inspiration, it gives us individual his own path to God, making his mind and heart a receptacle for godliness. So when we focus on freeing ourselves from our own limitations, wanting to connect to Hashem in a stronger way, we can then go to the next step of personalizing it, understanding to the best of our ability, and then once the more that we understand, the more that we feel, the more that we get excited, and the more that we're able to strengthen ourselves in our study of Torah, observance of mitzvahs, and making all those around us feel as excited as we are.